I believe everyone has a story to tell. And I believe everyone deserves a little pampering. Welcome to Mannies with Grannies. I'm your host, Tiffany Marino. Join me while I sit down with a woman over 70 and get to know her while giving her a manicure. Welcome to this episode of Mannies with Grannies. I'm very excited about today's episode. I'm with Marcy O'Brien. Marcy is a published author, and I had the opportunity to read her book before this episode. I don't usually have a lot of time to prepare for my interviews, so I don't typically have questions prepared. But today I do have some notes and some questions that I have based on the stories that I read in her book, which is called Rounding Third. Marcy, thank you so much for having me here today.
Oh, absolutely welcome. I'm delighted.
How are you feeling today?
Almost perfect.
Why almost?
Well, if I didn't have these 73 things wrong with me physically, I would be totally perfect, right? That's where we are at our stage of the game, I think. That's where the book got its name. I'm in the autumnal era of my life.
You take your hands out of here. How did the book come to be?
I started writing. I was just about 60, and I had an article I wanted to write. I was interested in getting back to some writing. I enjoyed it. In some organizations I was in, I wound up being secretary, and I thought, oh, this is sort of fun to make it interesting. And I thought, well, what could I do to write if I was doing more than this? And I spoke to my husband and said that I have a story from the airline days that's in my way. It was so important to me that I want to write it. I can go forward, but I've got to get that one written. And I did. It was a very sad story. It was about a couple that lost their son who was killed in St. Croix. I wrote the story and knew that it was a New England story. And it was about apples. They were apple farmers from Massachusetts. And I had met them on my flight from New York to St. Croix. I wrote the article. Yankee magazine said they were interested in it, but the timing was wrong. But if nobody else published it, come back the following year. And I called the editor of the Boston Globe magazine because I wanted it in New England. And I had a classmate who was an associate at the Globe. And I said to him, would you do me a favor, read this and take it to her? And if you think it's junk, throw it away and just tell me. And if you think it has any merit at all, would you pass it on? He said, sure. So I sent it to him, and I didn't hear from him, and I didn't hear from anybody. About a month later, this woman calls me in the afternoon and said, I've read your article. I'd like it for the December issue. And I mean, I was stunned. And it's the first thing I ever wrote. I think, my good God, I was sliding down the wall trying to contain myself, which I understand later from reading. I did. Stephen King did the same thing after years and years of trying to get published. And somebody called him on the phone and he said, as I was sliding down the wall, I read that years after this happened. It was really funny. So I wrote that and sold it and sold my next feature to the Washington Post. And then went on from there and was thinking, okay, this is sort of fun, as long as the marketing works out, the placement. Well, then my husband contracted cancer, and I spent the next couple of years dealing with that. And soon after he died, I realized I had to go back to work. So I went to the theater, and it took all my writing. There's a lot of writing involved in that job, and I didn't have any spare time to. But by then, I was writing a weekly column. That weekly column is a deadline every week, and that's the critical thing. There wasn't any time left over for any extracurricular writing. So that's how that started. And the columns, after I left the theater, I thought, this time, now, and I got COVID, and then I got COVID again, and when you're recuperating, you don't have much to do. You're so whipped that all I could really do was read. So I started reading all my old columns, hundreds and hundreds of them, and decided that, maybe there's a book here. And my editor had expanded my local column into a couple other regional papers, and I thought, wow, there's more readers. I'm hearing from more people. So maybe, I just was going to take a flyer and see if I could pull something together. And the more involved I got, I'm a member of the National Society of Newspaper Columnists, and I networked a lot of the connections through the group and made some nice friends there. So that's how the book really came to be.
So what year was your first piece published?
maybe 97.
And then from when you decided that you wanted to take the articles and make them into an anthology book, how long
Oh, you
was
mean
that
my
process?
first column published? Was 2004. The others were freelance, and I wasn't able to keep that up. Then when he passed, I had been writing the column for just a couple of years at that point.
What was the publishing process in the book like for you?
Well, I self-published because, first of all, it's a collection. It's a collection of columns from Mrs. Nobody from Podunk, basically. Okay? Because no major publishing house is going to take a chance on an unknown name on a collection of her newspaper columns. I mean, if it was Thomas Friedman from the Times or Doris Kearns Goodwin or somebody like that, and she wants to publish a book of columns, she's got them lined up with their checkbooks. But I knew better than that. And I also knew that I was running out of runway here. I mean, how many years do I want to throw at this? So if I want to get this done, I've got to do it myself. I don't know. I mean, I feel good, but there's that proverbial bus on the curb that you step off in front of.
Any day.
Any day, right.
Doesn't matter how old we are.
Yep. But the odds change a little as the years go by. They do.
How did you figure out how to be self-published?
Networking information and getting online and teaching myself, basically. A lot of research. It was a lot more involved than I thought. I thought, hey, they're all written. I mean, what do you have to do? Sit down with a friend and design a cover and staple them all together and get it out there? Well, no. I had COVID last February, was hospitalized again, and came home and thought, this is the heavy reading. I'm going to get going. And by the end of March, I'd selected about 120 of ones that I liked personally and what I thought were fitting. Not everything is appropriate, actually. And it's too localized or too specific or whatever. And I imposed on 8 friends to be my quote-unquote alpha readers. And they each took a notebook of 20 columns. My printer was going crazy at all hours of the night. They'd read them, and I asked them to give me a 1-line reaction and a grade 1 to 5. So each book of 20 came back with a page of 20 sentences and 20 numbers. And then I had to teach myself how to do a spreadsheet because I had no idea how to do that. And if I was going to use those numbers, the only way it made any sense was to do that. So that's how we got going on it. And there were some that were, everybody gave it 3s. It was not very much of an endorsement. There were a few that were split, like a 2 and a 5.5 on the same one. And then I looked at who they were and not just the interest level, but the background and the perspective that they were approaching it from. So I did have one young reader, 29, who was hard on a couple of subjects. When everybody else was putting in 5s, I had to throw him out and then tell him why. And I realized this book is not for 29-year-olds. It's a senior citizen. You have to be sort of 40 and above to really enjoy this, I think, because a lot of the living experiences are not the young college stuff. And the ones that are in a big, long look back.
Well, I'm 38 and I'm not finished the book yet. I just got it 2 days ago and I haven't had time to finish yet, but I'm halfway and I'm really enjoying it so far. I'm finding it relatable.
Oh, good. I'm loving that. That's good. Relatable has been the one word that keeps coming back, that people can, yeah, that happened to me, or I know what she means, or yeah, I know what that feels like. That's why I guess it's resonating.
I liked reading about how your mother would, well, I really love reading about your mother and so many things about
she was a package.
Her idiosyncrasies that you wrote about. I love about the $100 bills, but that's not actually what I want to ask about. I wanted to ask about the silverware set. Uh-huh. Did you end up getting a full silverware set before you married?
I have 12 8-piece place settings. And the only thing that I needed were, and she gave me a few and other people finished up with the serving pieces. Yeah. A complete set for 12. Everything you could think of. Well, no, only one pickle fork. Not 12. She was one of a kind.
You wrote about your mother liking her things.
Yes.
And you wrote about downsizing her home.
Which time?
And having to deal with her things.
Yes. You
predicted that you would be through it all in 2026. How far are you?
Half. We cleared the house, and I think I said in one of them, I'm not sure it was one that got published, that she was the president of Pack Rats International. Yeah. So we completely cleared the house, except for the 3 rental units I had to have while she was at the Rouse Suites. Plus, she filled her storage unit at the Rouse Suites. Plus, she had cases of canned goods stacked up the wall in her kitchenette at the Rouse kitchen in her apartment.
What's the most surprising thing you found?
Going through her things, some love letters. That was fun.
Did you know the person who wrote them?
Yes. I think I won't go further into them. The saddest thing about my mother's life was my stepdad fell for her in her late 20s, asked her to marry him every year for 20 years. And she said no. She said after how bitter the divorce was, how bad her marriage was, there wasn't a man out there that she could trust. She was going to be on her own, making her own decisions in a very misogynistic world, of course, back in the 40s and 50s. Nice women were not divorced in the 40s. They put up with whatever it took to remain married. My mother, well, she wouldn't have lived through it, first of all. It was that bad. But secondly, after that, there wasn't a man in the world good enough for her. It was just that she was going to make her own decisions, and she wasn't going to be reliant on anyone else. She knew what she was capable of, and she did. She worked 2 full-time jobs for 15 years. So I sort of half-raised myself. Right?
Did she end up marrying?
She had an accident in Los Angeles. She was helping an elderly relative, and she was putting away Christmas ornaments, climbed the ladder to put them on the rafter storage in the garage. The great-aunt neglected to tell her that the rafters were not secured. They were just up there. And she took a big box and pushed it forward, and she went forward with it and fell off the top of the ladder onto a cement floor and crushed her foot and ankle. After the surgery, they told her she would probably never walk again. And I called him. I lived in San Diego at the time, and I called him back in Massachusetts, and he walked into her hospital room the next day. He said, "All right, you finally need me. And I deserve some happiness, too. I've waited. I'm ready. You need me. This is it." And he said, "As soon as you can walk, we're getting married." And she said, "They told me I'd never walk again." He said, "That's not true. You will, because we're going to do it together." And he took all his vacation time, plus he was a contracts manager for Raytheon in Boston. And then he took long weekends and flew out and walked the beach with her on crutches in that wet sand, and got her back on her feet and back walking. And they got married in California before they came back. It was great. She was 50. He was 50. And I so wish that she'd married him 15 years sooner. I'd have had such a different life. He was a wonderful, dear prince of a man. And he loved her for her feistiness. They were very different from each other. He was quiet and loving and lovable.
How do you think your mother's independence affected you in your relationships?
In my relationships?
In your marriage.
Oh. A couple of early decisions in our marriage were made completely by my husband. And I was a bit annoyed. Actually, no, I was more than annoyed. I was ripped. This is a crazy example. It's in the book, actually. He was a Navy pilot based in San Diego, on Coronado Island. And I was a stewardess based in New York. And I would see him on my trips out there. That was how I met him. When we got married, I had a new Mustang convertible. And in 1966, silver was a new color. There were no silver cars. Now every other car is silver. Back then, it was new. And when I walked into that showroom in Boston, it was on the floor, beautifully lit, and it looked like a great big piece of jewelry. I mean, it was gorgeous. And I was so thrilled. It was my first real car because, you know, those Junkos, you drive early. And he had an Austin Healey 3000, which was sort of a grand sports car. It was costing him a fortune. It was only a year old, but British cars are notable for their poor electrical systems. And he was having lots of trouble, and I think it was dipping into his beer money, and his poker money. Anyway, he said, "We both have new cars. They're both expensive. We need to get rid of them and buy one utility vehicle. We don't need 2 cars." Well, I was flying out of San Diego and gone 2 or 3 days and then back home. And that meant that I was going to have to take him to work or stay home the days he took it. I was really unhappy, but he made the decision anyway. And we drove a Beetle for 6 years. Can you imagine trading those 2 cars for a Beetle? I'm surprised the marriage lasted, honestly. But we discovered each other. I think you finish growing up when you first get married. You start blending your value systems together. I think he learned that I was a fairly independent person. It took a while. I got more so and more so. And he agreed that I should be able to do what I wanted to do, and he would do what he wanted to do. He played golf, and I read a lot. He read even more than I do. So we were a family of readers, and our kids are too. Also, he became very pro-woman through the political scene. And that reflected in our marriage also. And then, of course, after he passed, I was totally on my own. And honestly, the last job I had, I would never have predicted, made me very independent. But I'd been given opportunities at American. I became a stewardess supervisor. And then I got moved to management at corporate headquarters. That was a touch of independence. That was before our first child was born. And then I had a good-sized mail-order business I ran and had to go to New York and do the buying and deal with the bankers and the lawyers and the contracts and all that. So, you gradually, you grow into the person you become. I don't think you start out that way, but I had my mother's example that you take it as it comes, but you hang on to what's important. Be true to yourself. She was very much that way.
You mentioned being a stewardess.
Mm-hmm.
I enjoy reading about that as well. You list a lot of celebrities that you met. Were you ever starstruck?
No, after you see them in those circumstances, no. And living out in the West Coast and living in New York, you see a lot of them. Not really. No, not even by Elvis or Frankie Sinatra. Or I could have been, I think. I will tell you this. I thought James Garner was the most gorgeous man I'd ever laid eyes on. A young James Garner. He was really something. And I don't know if you would know this name. Eddie Arnold. He was old country musician. Very handsome, very courtly, very lovely man. I got to know a double handful of them really well because one of my flights went through Nashville and it went to L.A. and back. So I got to know Johnny Cash and Roger Miller and Eddie Arnold. And, they knew me by my first name and I would see them often enough that, good guys, all of them. But Eddie Arnold was so courtly, and he called me Ms. Marcy. And I was, 20s, and he was probably late 40s, 50s maybe. One day he's standing at the door, and I said, Mr. Arnold, are you married? And he said, yes, I am, Miss Marcy. And he smiled, and I said, gee. And he said, yeah, there's an occasional time that I wish I weren't, but frankly, I've been a good guy. He just looked at me, and I looked at him, and he was just very stunning guy. And I just thought, nah, behave yourself. Johnny Cash was in the worst of his drugs and alcohol and all that. And yet he was quiet. He wanted to be alone a lot because he felt terrible, which one night during a delay, he sat and told me all about the troubles. And he knew there was really only one way forward. To get rid of it and give it up. I spent an entire evening of about 6 hours sitting talking to Jonathan Winters during a weather delay. He was an absolute delight. He said, I've been in the loony bin 3 or 4 times. I've lost track now. My wife is still there for me, the world's most wonderful woman. And he said, because she knows I'm genuinely crazy. She gets it. He was a Marine. We sat and we talked about the military, about education. He was a painter. We talked about art. We talked about travel. We talked elementary education, growing up. There wasn't anything we didn't talk about. He was that nice a guy. I said at the end of it, when we finally got to L.A. at midnight or 1 a.m, I said, how did we fall into this conversation? He said, I don't know. It seemed to work at the time. He said, I had fun, did you? I said, absolutely. And he gave me a big hug and he said, okay, take care. I'll see you later. It was the most delightful evening. And he just sort of opened up. He said he was really comfortable. And I think he probably gets interviewed by a lot of people and gets asked the same old questions. I didn't ask him any questions. We just talked. What a nice man he was.
Would you like to choose a nail color?
Yeah, I want to try that and see how
one?
It looks. Yeah. Yeah, but there was some people like Jaja and Joan Crawford, and there were more. But there was only a handful, and those are the ones you remember every little thing about. I had a conversation with Carol Burnett one day, and it was the second time in a month I'd had her on board. And I said, Miss Burnett, I had a bad experience last week with one of the famous, and I didn't tell her who it was. And I said, but she's infamously bad, and she was. And I said, why do celebrities do that? I said, you come on and you are perfectly delightful, fun, warm, and she said, I don't understand it. I just don't get it. She said, the only thing different about my life today than when I was young, I wear better shoes. She said, other than that, I'm the same person. Who else would I be,
You wrote about your around the world trip.
Yes.
And you made many amazing stops.
Mm-hmm.
How did you decide where you were going to go?
Well, there were some restrictions. We couldn't back up. And the other thing was we didn't go too far off the beaten path because it takes time to get back to the routes that were offered. So like going to Agra was special, and we had to get back in time to take another airline to get there and then back. For example, we're going to France first. It was obvious to me, I'd never been there, that we would go to Paris. And I wish I'd gotten in my lifetime to Provence, but I never did. It breaks my heart, but it happens. And then it was the Pan American routes. And this was Pan Am's Flight 1. And we only went off of it once or twice, as long as we progressed forward. It didn't give lots of variation. We could have done a great deal more, I think, but we had such a short notice by the time my husband agreed to do it. We had 5 days to get ticketed.
Were there any cities you wouldn't go back to?
I wouldn't go back to India at all. The poverty clobbered me. I really, really was not prepared. I was told it wasn't good, but the depth of it was, it's hard to even think about it.
You said that the trip changed you.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think you were changed?
My mind was much more opened to people, and not Americans, but other people. Actually, it was seeing things like that. It was, for example, we took off out of Delhi at 5 a.m. The sun was just coming up. And as we turned onto the runway, my husband and I looked out the window, and he was pilot. And the runway was full of buzzards, big birds, just, I wouldn't say 100, but maybe 60, 80 buzzards, a big flock. And the captain sat there and revved the engines up and back, and they didn't go anywhere. And finally, he just decided to take off. And my husband is thinking, what the heck is he doing? Is he out of his mind? And he said, I'm not seeing that they're going anywhere. And we took off, and we headed down the runway, and we started hearing the buzzards hit the plane. It was awful. And then when we took into two jets, and just at takeoff time, at rotate time, he aborted the takeoff. And we barely stopped at the end of the runway. And of course, what we did was cleared the runway, and Aeroflot turned and took off right after us, the Russian airline. And I thought, wow, they know how to clear a runway. Send an American flight out first. But things like that people would make decisions like that. My husband was furious, and he demanded to see the part of because we all were stopped for hours, naturally. We had 2 dead engines. The part of the captain's book that says decisions about birds. It was incredible. And it's captain's discretion. And you got all those souls in the back behind the door. But it was seeing, for example, there was an Englishman who said to us on another trip, and this is what made me realize how much there was to learn traveling. We were out in the countryside, and we'd talked to the shopkeeper for a while, been in his family for generations. And he said, so how does it feel, Yank? Here we were, he said, 63 million sheep farmers, and we ruled the world. And now here you are, and you've got it all on your shoulders. How does it feel? And I thought, people really do think about these things. They really do worry about them all over the world, not just us. And having people be really, really nice to us everywhere we went was a big eye-opener. The importance of manners. The fact that I read so much about the quote-unquote ugly American. we need to behave better when we leave this country. Yeah, it was the people. Just totally the people. Everybody was so kind to us.
Thinking over your life, what's your most romantic memory?
Wow. Nobody's ever asked me that question. Tom O'Brien and I, when we went on vacation, we realized we'd gotten into a habit. We would get to the hotel, check our stuff in, go directly to the bar, and have Bloody Marys. Always the same drink. We checked into a hotel in Little Dick's Bay in the British Virgin Islands and went directly to the bar. And the only bar that was open was in the pool. And he wasn't much of a swimmer. And he hated the water. And so he went back and put on his swim trunks so we could go to the bar and have our Bloody Marys. And we sat there realizing how very lucky we were, how happy we were. What a nice little tradition we had. It was just one that we just sort of lived over and over again. Small, but nice.
That's where all the romance is, right?
Yeah.
In the small moments.
Yeah.
I like that story a lot.
Yeah. I never thought of it, though. I never really... That's great. Thank you.
What is your most prized possession?
Well, I don't own them anymore, but my children, they're my proudest. I have a stunningly simple little thing. I'll show it to you afterwards. It's a little picture, hand-painted in Bavaria. After the violence, when my mother left my father, she came back 3 days later to move out. We only had one neighbor. It was just a little stub of a street, 2 houses. And Mrs. McDonald, who adored me, we were leaving there. I was just shy of 4. And she said to my mother, I want her to have this when she grows up so that she has some memories of living here, and you will always remember it because you'll be keeping it for her. It's funny, I never knew this lady, but my mother treasured the little picture so much because it was to be kept for me, which didn't make a lot of sense to me as a kid. But I do treasure it. I would grab it along with the wedding pictures when the flood comes or the hurricane.
Tell me about the ring you're wearing.
Oh, wow. The center stone was my original engagement stone. And actually, it was bigger until my husband ground it up in the garbage disposal. We'd been married 6 weeks. I had taken it off and put it in a glass of ammonia by the sink just to freshen it up a little. He came home and saw it there, got a glass of water at the kitchen sink, saw this glass of dirty water, he thought. The ammonia was gray. So he just chucked it down there. And I didn't think anything of it. He didn't turn the disposal on. It was just water. I came home. I realized I had forgotten my ring, but I came home and started dinner and started using the garbage disposal for like cucumber slices or something, turned it on and started hearing the clanking. And I looked over and saw that the glass was gone. And I went, oh my God. And I reached down in there and sure enough, the ring was shaped like this. The 4 prongs were out, no stone. And it only took 3 or 4 turns of it to do a lot of damage. So we took it down to the local San Diego had Jessup's Jewelry, which is sort of their Tiffany's. And they said, well, it would probably need a new setting. They didn't think that that could be repaired. About 1/3 of a carat was cut out of the depth of it, a chunk. They said, no, they're not indestructible. If it hits just right on a cut or bevel, it could shatter it into like dust. But anyway, our insurance company offered us a choice of, we can have the stone recut, we'll pay for that and the new setting, okay? Or we can replace the stone at the value that you did, and we will take that stone. Or we will use our buying services and try to buy what you would like. Who gets 3 offers from an insurance company, you know? So stupid me. I've been married 6 weeks. Oh, it's my stone. I have to keep the original stone. I had it cut down. What an idiot I was. But anyway, so that's what I wore as a solitaire. That was my wedding ring on a wide band for years. And then I had it reset with these 2 family stones on either side of it after Tom died. And then 5 years later, when I married Richard, he said, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I was still wearing the ring because I liked it. I'd worn it for 40 years. And I said, well, I can't see putting that in the jewelry box. It's the nicest thing I own. So he bought the sapphires and he bought the new setting. So it's sort of a yours, mine, and ours because these were from my great uncle. And because I have such bad arthritis, I can't get this off. It has a mechanism in it. Can you see a little dot?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. You press on that dot, this hinges open and I can take it off. But other than that, if you want to get it off me, you have to cut it off me because I didn't want to be taking it off and on. And if I made it big enough to clear the knuckle, it would be spinning all the time. So it was an expensive thing to do, but it was very worthwhile, and I'd wear it with a lot of comfort.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, I'm happy with it.
We are at the end of our manicure. Is there anything else you want to talk about today?
No, this was delightful. Won't you have some lemon cookies?
Yes. Very good. I'm making crumbs, though.
What a nice thing to do. I wasn't even much aware of you doing this. You asked me some questions I have never thought of.
Thank you for listening to Manny's with Grannies. I hope you enjoyed learning about someone else and maybe even learned a little about yourself.